Hello, and welcome to my second Ms. Pac-Man tutorial, this one dealing with the subject of grouping. Now, before we begin, I want to mention a couple of things. First of all, I'm assuming that you have knowledge of the Ghost AI. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I recommend you check out my previous video tutorial where I explain in some detail how the red, pink, green, and orange ghosts all think. Second thing I want to mention is that even though I'm gearing this tutorial for the beginner, you should be warned that there's nothing at all easy about this. Grouping is a very, very advanced concept, and it will take you some practice. If you are looking for shortcuts, you won't find any of that in this video. What I'm hoping instead is to teach you the principles underlying grouping techniques, in the hopes that you will be creative and one day come up with your own grouping techniques. So, with that in mind, let's jump right in. What exactly is grouping? Well, grouping is the science and, in my opinion, art of getting the ghosts in Ms. Pac-Man to clump together very closely. Why is this important? Well, I think if you were to ask most people, they would tell you it's so that you can eat all four ghosts at the Energizers. And while that is technically true, believe it or not, that's not the primary reason to group the ghosts, at least not in my opinion. No, the real reason why you want to keep the ghosts grouped is quite simply that you're less likely to die if the ghosts are in a group. This is because if you are able to get the ghosts in a group and keep them together, you have effectively neutralized the numerical disadvantage you have when playing Ms. Pac-Man. If you had been watching this example without your glasses on, you might have mistakenly come to the conclusion that Pac-Man was in fact a one-on-one game, and that is exactly the point. Now, as it happens, keeping all four ghosts in a group is very, very difficult, and in many instances it's actually not even possible. So to begin with, we're not going to group all four ghosts. Instead, we're going to ignore the orange ghost and focus only on grouping the red, pink, and green ghosts, which I will from here on refer to as the three primary ghosts. Even though technically we are outnumbered in this situation, as you can see, this is still a pretty easy situation to deal with. So with that in mind, let's jump in and take a look at our first example. As you can see, the red ghost is separated from the green ghost by a certain distance, and we're going to try and get these ghosts together. We're going to do this by utilizing this maze structure on the upper left, which I think of as a giant funnel. It always seems to me that you kind of pour the ghosts into the top of it and they come out together at the bottom. In real time, this technique looks like this. Now, before we continue, I want to go back and take a look at this grouping technique again and see if maybe we can figure out why it works. First of all, note that the ghosts take exactly the same path until they get to this white X here. At this point, however, their paths diverge. The red ghost goes around the left-hand side of the funnel, while the green ghost actually heads straight down. They then meet up again at this second X and exit the bottom of the funnel together. Note also that the path taken by the front ghosts, in this case the red ghost, is actually longer than the path taken by the rear ghost. In fact, the difference in length between the two paths is almost exactly equivalent to the difference in distance between the ghosts before we started. It is these characteristics that in my mind make up the fundamental principles of grouping. And this is so important that I'm going to go through it again one more time. The ghosts to be grouped take two different paths to reach the same point, and they do so in such a manner that the path taken by the front ghosts is longer than the path taken by the rear ghosts. That's it. That's the fundamental principle of grouping. Every single grouping technique that you ever see, no matter how fancy, is based on these principles. Now, even though this technique is very effective, it's not always the most practical technique, since it requires you to go all the way to the top of the maze and then bring the ghosts back down. In the next example, we're going to take a look at a technique where you can actually approach it from the bottom. Now note, once again, that the ghosts are going to take two different paths to the same point in such a way that the path taken by the front ghosts is longer. This technique looks like this. Now, there's a few things I want to point out about this. You probably noticed, first of all, that this technique is basically the reverse of the very first technique I taught you. I'm pointing this out because it's worth remembering that many grouping techniques work equally well in more than one direction. So if and when you find grouping techniques of your own, you should certainly experiment with approaching them from a different angle. You'd be surprised at how many possibilities exist from just one simple idea. The second thing I want to point out is the possibility of combinations. I know that you all noticed that the three primary ghosts are grouped here, but how many of you noticed that the orange ghost behind them is now perfectly set up to be grouped in the funnel on the right-hand side? Now, I'm cheating a little bit because I told you we were going to ignore the orange ghost, but still, that could just as easily have been a red, pink, or green ghost. So keep in mind that you shouldn't just focus exclusively on the ghosts you're trying to group. You do need to keep your eye on the whole maze. And if you can keep your eye on the whole maze, oftentimes you can string grouping combinations together to very, very good effect. Finally, I want to point out that this is an extremely practical grouping technique. This is because right after you eat an energizer, the ghosts will exit the box and head to the left. And if you can position yourself properly, you'll be ideally placed to group the ghosts almost instantly. And remember, the quicker you can group the ghosts, the less likely it is that you'll find yourself dying. Now, before we go on to dealing with the orange ghost, I'd like to share one last grouping technique with you. This one begins in the same starting position as the previous one I showed you, but instead of going up through the middle of the funnel, we're actually going to go around the outside. Note, once again, the ghosts take two separate paths to the same point, and the path taken by the front ghosts is longer than the path taken by the rear ghosts. In real time, this looks like this. Now, like the previous grouping technique I showed you, this one lends itself very well to combinations. Also, like the previous grouping technique I showed you, it's a very good one to know for grouping ghosts right as they come out of the box after you've eaten them at an energizer. However, there is one further characteristic that I wish to point out to you, which is that this grouping technique takes place around a maze segment that is shaped like an L. If we were to take a step back and look at the entire maze for a moment, you might notice that there actually are quite a few maze segments that are shaped like an L. For example, there's this one here on the middle left. As it happens, it is possible to group the ghosts around this maze segment as well. You may have noticed this L-shaped segment down at the lower left. Once again, it is possible to group the ghosts around this maze segment as well. In fact, every single time that there is an L-shaped maze segment, no matter how big or small the maze segment is, it is always possible to group the ghosts around it, in theory. And this can be mathematically proven. Hopefully, you find this bit of information useful as you get better and better at this game. If you've made it this far, you're ready to try grouping the orange ghost. By now you may have noticed that trying to group the orange ghost doesn't quite work the same way as it does for the others. Take this example here. As you can see, I already have all four ghosts grouped, but I can't seem to keep them together. If I head up the left side, well, the orange ghost ran away. Try to group them over here, he went through the tunnel. If I were to try and head down here and maybe try and get, well, nope, that didn't work either. So as you can see, the orange ghost has a tendency to run away from you anytime you get close to him. So how in the world can we get the orange ghost to group with the other three when he keeps running away from us anytime we get close to him? The secret is to remember that the orange ghost is not actually running away from you when you get close to him, but instead is running towards something else, specifically the lower left corner. Now that may not seem like an important distinction, but it actually is very important, because once you know that, you also can figure out that if you get between the orange ghost in the lower left corner, and then get close to the orange ghost, he'll actually turn towards you instead of away from you. Realize that, and you can take it even a step further. If you get between the orange ghost and the lower left corner and run towards the lower left corner yourself, he will in fact appear to chase you. If you think about this for a little bit, a plan starts to become clear. We are going to use a method I call the intercept technique. The idea is deceptively simple. First, you get the three primary ghosts into a group and get them following you. Next, you insert yourself between the orange ghost and the lower left corner in such a way that the primary ghosts and the orange ghost intercept. You then head to the lower left corner, and voila! You now have a group of 4 ghosts completely under your control. There are many different methods of doing this. The method I'm going to teach you uses the funnel at the upper left corner of the maze. What you're going to do is first group the 3 primary ghosts and then lead them up to the upper left. After this, you will go in a circle clockwise until the orange ghost approaches. If you exit the bottom of the funnel at the right time, the ghosts will intercept, and then you can head down to the lower left. Now, there are several different ways that the orange ghost can approach, and the timing is slightly different for each of them. I don't really want to spend a ton of time going over every possible permutation of this technique, but trust me when I tell you that with a little bit of practice, you'll be a master of this technique in no time. So obviously this technique works perfectly fine if your target is the lower left corner of the maze. But what do we do if we want to go somewhere else on the maze, like, say, the upper right? How do we keep these 4 ghosts together? The secret is distance. Remember, the orange ghost runs to the lower left only when he gets close to you. When he's far away from you, he actually behaves in exactly the same way that the red ghost does. So, if you can put distance between yourself and the group of 4, they will stay together. So how do we put distance between ourselves and the group of 4? There are 2 methods. The first is the tunnel. The tunnel gives us the ability to instantly transport ourselves to the opposite side of the maze, thereby creating distance. Now, if I wanted to, I could go directly up to the right energizer. But in this example, I'm instead going to continue to use the tunnels to control the ghosts even further. We've all thought of the tunnel as a defensive tool used to effect escapes, but you may not have realized that it can be used as an offensive tool as well, as in this example. Now, sometimes using the tunnel is not practical, and in those cases, we have another method at our disposal. That method is to divert the ghosts. Now, in order to use this method, you are going to have to be extremely familiar with the ghost's AI. In this particular example, I'm going to head to a spot right here. Now, instead of coming over to eat me, the ghosts actually get fooled and they head the opposite direction. At this point, I can run away from them and head to the Energizer. I also, of course, could have headed to the tunnel and controlled the ghosts that way, as I did in the previous example. One last thing I'll say about the diversion method is that if you ever get the psychotic urge to play Junior Pac-Man, a game with no tunnels at all, you and this method will need to be best friends. This brings us to the conclusion of this tutorial. There's an awful lot of information in here, and I hope you find it helpful. The only thing I haven't done is put these principles into their proper context. So I'm going to do that now by sharing with you some gameplay. I'm going to play through the first 2 mazes. Now, I'm not necessarily going to stick to the actual techniques that I taught here. I'm going to use a few that I did not teach here. This is not because I'm a jerk or because I want to show off. Rather, it is to remind you that ultimately, I want you to use the principles that I've taught, not the techniques. And I hope that you can go on and create your own as you get better and better at the game. Thank you for watching, and I wish you the best of luck.